and fair trade. Yeah, and I'm pretty excited to be here for today's session. Very timely topics that we have. We have 3 presentations for you today, but before we get on to that, just a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to share. So for our presentations, if when we start, if you could all turn off your cameras and microphones, that would be great. And then we can turn cameras back on for the presentation, for the, the talk and Q&A section. So we have 3 presentations. We'll be each presenting for about 15 minutes, and then we're going to be saving questions till the end. Before I go on to introducing our speakers, I would like to just provide an acknowledgement today of the lands that we are on. And so Congress has provided one to pertain to, for all of us, where we all are. So I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous people and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis peoples. And I guess I will just acknowledge myself that I'm joining you from the township of Erin in Ontario, where I am on Treaty 19 territory, traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and various other Indigenous groups. Okay, and I would also like to say one thing that I've been hearing loud and clear throughout this conference as I've been attending it so far is the message that acknowledgement is not enough, that there needs to be action as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I acknowledge that acknowledgement is not enough, and that as much as we can talk about action in our discussions as well, that would be a great contribution. Yeah, I think that's generally it for housekeeping items. You can put your questions, if you have them throughout, you can put them in the chat, or you can just put your name in the chat, and then we know to get you on at the end to ask your question. Okay, and so with that, I think we're ready to begin. The first presentation today is going to be by Daryl Reed. He'll be presenting on fair trade and the Sustainable Development Goals, the case of the small producer symbol. Okay, Daryl, and like I said, if everybody could mute, that'd be great, and maybe put yourself on speaker view as well. No. Okay, Daryl, we can't hear you right now.
Okay.
There you are, now we can.
Okay, I'm just trying to get everything together there. Oops. In light of the larger theme of the versatility of cooperatives, I wanted to talk about one specific movement, which is the fair trade movement, and how cooperatives participate in that. And I'm talking about the SDGs, not so much because they're so important as they provide indicators, and they're a discourse in which we talk about performance, especially in the fair trade world. So what I'm going to do is talk very briefly, 30 seconds on the SDGs. Then I'm going to look at 4 forms of innovation that the co-op sector has engaged in to be able to make the SDGs actually work for them, because it's a bit of a conflictual relationship in the fair trade world in many ways. So again, what the SDGs are and 4 cooperative interventions. Too many slides, I will go over them quickly. You're not missing anything when I go over them too quickly. You all heard of the Millennium Development Goals. What's new with the Sustainable Development Goals? There's more goals. and they start talking about pathways and actors. So there's the goals, you all know those. Fair trade, like many organizations, has developed a conceptual framework and methods for how they think they facilitate the sustainable development goals. So very simply, they say if you set a minimum price for fair trade, that's an intervention. That leads to an output here, the protection of price volatility. That leads to an outcome, increased profitability, and that has an impact, higher income. And then you can measure that in different ways to show what sustainable development goals it's leading to. Now, if you see here in the bottom, there's a whole bunch of different types of interventions leading to outputs, outcomes, and different impacts. And then you can break those down into more details, et cetera, right? Now, the real question then is about actors in the types of interventions that they're engaging in, because that's going to make all the difference in the world with regard to these pathways. So in fair trade, the question becomes, are we talking about production by small producers? Or are we talking about production on private estates? Because that's allowed. Are we talking about mission-driven intermediaries or corporate intermediaries? Are we talking about corporate distributors or cooperative distributors? And the certifying agencies, are they solidarity-based or is their goal poverty reduction? So all of these things will impact how these get done. And also how committed they are to interventions. Is a full range of interventions, and is their commitment 100%, or is it very small or symbolic, as we often see in the fair trade movement? So the first thing we need to be aware of is that fair trade was actually initiated by a small producer cooperative in Mexico with an NGO. So this was a form of cooperative innovation, the first form, and it comes at a time when there's serious problems in the South in agricultural markets. Trade liberalization is going on, the end of government marketing boards, high price fluctuations. There was one initiative to support small producers there called alternative trade, in which some NGOs started buying products, selling them in informal ways in church basements after services, or what were then called third world shops. These were nice. The small producers liked these, but they sold a very, very small amount of their product through these stores. And so in 1988, this producer association decided to develop its own certification body, and its goal was to get access to conventional markets under better conditions, because that's where they sold the vast majority of their product. And so what they were looking for was minimum price guarantees, a social premium, long-term contracts. And what they're basically doing then is setting up a non-state regulatory system, which is backed by consumer choices, and also is going to involve consumer education and mobilization and some support from NGOs. So if we look at the pathways then, we can see that supporting democratically organized producers encourages producer organization, it strengthens them, it gives them better marketing, bargaining power in markets, guaranteed minimum prices, higher income, less volatility, social premiums, gives them dedicated funds for capacity development, stronger organizations, increased sustainability, etc. Long-term contracts reduce risk, allow them to plan, diversify, build more value added, and support for capacity building allows them to increase their capacity in three key areas: organization, we're talking governance and management, production, and commercialization. And all those will then lead to higher sales, higher sale prices, more value added, more sustainable production. And that's what they were trying to do with fair trade. Their ability to do that depends upon their ability to get buyers, market access, and how much they can sell in that. The types of buyers, whether they're sort of co-op and mission-driven or whether they're corporate buyers, whether they can get access to other resources, local, national, regional government programs, domestic, international NGOs, and from the buyers themselves, and their actual ability with the limited resources they have to increase their organizational capacity to innovate. And we'll talk more detail about those various things that have to happen. Now, that was the start, but what happened very quickly after introducing this, there was a diversification of national labeling bodies. Other people, NGOs, came in and set up their own labels. They came together in 1997 with some new harmonized standards. And in that process, they completely eliminated small producers from any decision-making role. The only members now are going to be the national initiatives run by NGOs for the most part in the North. And small producers who were the object of this program now had no decision-making power. Moreover, these bodies started to introduce production by private estates, so they were now competing within the fair trade label with small producers. And they also watered down the standards. They didn't require minimum guaranteed prices. When there were prices, they didn't increase those over time. All new products were able to use estate production. They didn't encourage long-term contracts. There was minimum capacity building. If you're working with a corporation, that was only about quality control. So we had this mission drift within fair trade. So that leads to the second innovation by small producers, the second sort of stage in their development. They developed a continental-wide association. This started in Mexico with one national association and one product network in coffee and another one in honey, but that developed across Latin America and the Caribbean within a few years. And again, the goals were to support new and fledgling cooperatives and producer associations to learn from each other around different forms of capacity, product information, to mobilize so they can represent their interests better within the fair trade certifying body, which they were able to do over time. And they did get seats on the board, and now they nominally have an equal number of seats, and to promote domestic and south fair trade as well. And again, we can then see how this works through different pathways, strengthening the individual organizations, but growing and leveraging their collective capacity, local network building, representing themselves with local, regional, national governments, representation within fair trade, and representation in the North with a whole bunch of allies, consumers and trade advocates, activists, government agencies, intergovernmental organizations. That was the second intervention, the second form of innovation. The third thing they tried to do is, because they weren't fully satisfied with the relationship within the fair trade organization, and their products weren't labeled as being produced by small producers, they set up their own small producer symbol. This originally started in Mexico when the producers there tried to develop their own national body, Fair Trade Mexico, but that was never recognized fully by the larger organization. Then as CLAC, they tried to set up a new symbol, but Fair Trade International would not allow them to do that. So they had to set up a separate organization called the Small Producer Symbol, which they set up in 2015. Here, the goal was to ensure certification that's controlled by small producers. Now they allow others to participate, but they want to protect and promote their interests in this, which includes setting higher standards, having longer term contracts, requiring buyers to buy processed products when they're available so they get more value added, requiring them to push more products over time, so there's minimum purchase requirements, and also so they can impose stronger commitments to sustainability and control over their local lands and ecosystems. And again, also to promote domestic and fair trade, fair trade. So you can again see how this leads to different pathways for the Sustainable Development Goals. I won't go through all of those exactly, but generally they have higher standards, they get greater consumer citizen awareness, because people can now identify those products not just as fair trade, and those fair trade bananas might well be from a large plantation, which has been processed by a large multinational, Dole or whatever, and sold at a corporate supermarket. So there's no participation whatsoever by cooperatives or small producers anywhere in that chain. And then there's greater benefits for the solidarity-based buyers, those intermediaries, because they can also distinguish themselves better in the fair trade world. Now, none of this matters unless the cooperatives themselves can be innovative and can compete in fair trade markets. And if they don't do that, then it makes no difference if they have a certification. And this is where we really got the growth of fair trade, is because you got some key cooperatives being really, really innovative. Usiri in Mexico was one of the first ones, but the one I want to look at is Norandino, which is in northern Peru. So I want to talk a little bit, a rather crude distinction here between innovation and entrepreneurship, because we want to talk about innovation in terms of people who are introducing new products, practices, technologies, new organizational forms that provide them with a competitive advantage. And I see Daphne, I see that someone's there indicating that I have 2 minutes left. And then there's entrepreneurship. Those are the other organizations that come in afterwards, and they still have to take on risk and do these sorts of changes within the organization to participate. So what we get within fair trade is we get this innovation by some first movers, and then we find that these cooperatives bring in and collaborate with new cooperatives, and that's exactly what Norandino did. And we can, I won't go through this timeline. They're up in northern Piura here in the state, which has very limited, agricultural reasons, mostly in the West, but they develop cooperatives in all of the surrounding regions, which are agriculturally much more better. So they initiated their own cooperative, and then they supported and incubated a whole bunch of other cooperatives. And they did this on the basis of innovation in their organization. They set up their own domestic NGO, which is their partner, their sister organizations. So they do all of the development, helping develop the new organizations, training them and everything. And that allows Norandino to do the commercialization. They've also set up second-tier cooperatives, so those people can be brought into those and buy processing services and not from them. There was innovation in production and growing. They had introduced new harvesting and growing practices to compete in these markets. They had to introduce new forms of processing to meet requirements to get certification. They had to move into secondary processing, moving up the value chain to capture more value added. They had to set in award-winning quality control systems to ensure traceability, and new products. So creating new products through processing, not just exporting the raw commodities, but they set up their own sugar. And if you go to buy La Siembra sugar, it's coming from these guys. Cacao, not just selling beans, but liquor, buds, and now they set up their own chocolate factory and agricultural products. They're selling carbon credits, organic fertilizers. And finally, they had the innovation and commercialization. And I won't go through that because I just want to get to this summary slide here, which talks about how Norandino innovated to introduce fair trade production in their governments, their production and commercialization, but with the support from NGOs and co-ops. So they were able to leverage this system to grow and to support these new cooperatives in surrounding areas, which expanded greatly the production of these things, which in turn allowed them to move up the value chain into processing and more value added. This success led them to move beyond fair trade because now they could compete in quality markets and they didn't have to rely on those solidarity buyers. They could compete against the best growers anywhere in the world purely on the basis of quality, especially in the coffee and cocoa market. In the sugar market, that's not a quality market, so 100% of their product is bought by cooperatives. So they couldn't compete in that market if they didn't have their solidarity buyers. So it gets very complicated. And finally, Norandino was the innovator, but all of these other co-ops replicated what they were doing. They were still entrepreneurial, which multiplied the SDGs effect across a much wider range and basically provided a model for economic development for the entire region. And I think that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Daryl. That's a lot of great information there. So we'll be saving our questions till the end, as mentioned before. So keep those coming, put those in the chat if you have any. And now we'll be moving on. We have two presentations that link to our COVID-19 theme, something that we're all very familiar with right now. And the first will be from Russ Christianson and Judith Harris on cooperative long-term care. So.
Do you want to start, Judith?
Uh-oh. Judy, are you with us?
I'm with you. Hello.
Hi.
I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. So Russ Christianson and I have just recently connected around a concern regarding the need to support the cooperative model for seniors care. Both of us have personal experience with long-term care homes in Ontario since our parents became residents. Russ is a co-op developer working with 3 personal service workers who are establishing a workers' co-op. So the question is, why do we not hear more about the cooperative model at a time when co-ops offer a solution to much that went wrong during the pandemic? Here's a photo of a vigil held in November 2020 for COVID victims who died at Maples Personal Care Home in Winnipeg. During the 3-month outbreak, 157 residents were infected, and this is a 200-bed facility. The Maples Personal Care Home was a focus of a provincial study that reported some of the problems: lack of communication with families, lack of urgency and calls for help, inadequate staff and training. And here you can see crosses that are representing residents who died of COVID at Camilla Care Community in Mississauga. So this was one of the hardest hit among Ontario's personal care homes. And this is a pattern that you've seen across Canada. So there are similar stories. And back in 2010, John Restakis provided a heart-wrenching story about spousal separation. So when needs change, this kind of separation happens often. And John's argument is that when it comes to relation-based services, cooperatives are the best option. A recent CBC Ideas program on the common good and seniors care stated what we all know. We fear the nursing home. We fear it as the poor feared the workhouse. My own experience and observations include the following. I know that scientific studies indicate sitting results in falls. Patients deteriorate waiting in hospital beds. Infantilizing, something I think about, you know, it's very damaging. And there's a lack of respect, which is demoralizing. I know sometimes my mom was not given her glasses or even her teeth in the morning. So what are the lessons that we're learning? Lesson 1, COVID-19 laid bare our neglect of elders and their caregivers. So for-profit homes had 2 times the COVID-19 infection rate of public and other facilities. They had a 78% higher death rate. This is the result of privatization and for-profit cost cuts. And we also see that employment is dangerous and precarious for caregivers. What else did we find out? Lesson 2, ageism is a root cause of the long-term care crisis. And I know when I first got my vaccine shot, I looked around and I thought, I don't look as old as those other people who are here. So, you know, I think ageism is everywhere. Our elders are not treated as full members of society. Their humanness is stripped away, and we speak of them in the third person. He is forgetting. She shouldn't be using the stove. And the third lesson, PSWs are very undervalued. They're underpaid and face precarious employment. There's a lack of respect for PSWs. They are the first ones families complain to. They are poorly paid and are on call and have no benefits. We plan to explore the gendered, racialized, and classist context of their work. Cooperatives and elder care. Canada spends 30% less than other OECD countries on long-term care and home care. I was pretty shocked by how we treat our seniors. Martha Carmichael says, we've always known that humans are social creatures, and that has never been more clear, I think, in our times. So COVID-19 has really shown us what John Restakis was talking about, that co-ops are superior for relation-based services. Here are a few more quotations on ageism from Margaret Morgenroth Guillet. I'm arguing about the social determinants of death. This is one of the things we've found. 8 out of 10 of those who died due to COVID-19 were over 65, and the cause was not biological. These people died because of socially accepted prejudice. So I want to leave you with these comments from Bev Chakouti, an RN, who is the head of the Family Council at St. Joseph's Villa in Sudbury. She says that options that avoid a medical model are far superior. We need to do more for the PSWs. They are seldom heard when they voice a concern. They must have a consistent national level training program. The residents are there to live their lives. Bev got a little bit passionate about this. One doctor, she said, told them they come here to die. And she said she was speechless and had to calm herself down. When I look at the long-term care facilities, she says, this was the best that we had in town. So Russ, I think you're going to take over now and can tell me when you want me to change the slides.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Judith. It's pretty sobering, and I think we're all aware of that. And this has been a problem for a long time before COVID came around. And you can see Doug Ford, so in Ontario, who's the premier, but well before Doug Ford, there was Mike Harris, a Conservative premier, who actually privatized and brought in for-profit long-term care homes to Ontario. And he's profited generously from that over the time. He's the chair of the board of Chartwell, which is one of the poorest performing and one of the long-term care homes with the highest death rate. So like all co-ops, there's clearly a need for PSW home care based co-ops. You can go to the next slide. So I'm not going to go over these stats. You can read them yourself, but there's just, this is pointing out very clearly the need for home care cooperatives with PSWs being well taken care of as well. If the caregivers are taken care of, then they can do a good job of taking care of the people that we cherish. One thing I want to mention is that, you know, this isn't just an economic story. This is a very emotional, human story. And I know my own mother died 3 years ago of dementia. And it's almost, when you have a parent or a loved one who has dementia, it's almost like they die twice. And, you know, she had good care, and that was fortunate, but many, many people don't. And one of the things that people want to do is they want to age at home. So they don't want to go to a long-term care home because they see that as the place that, you know, they want to avoid, especially now with COVID. Go to the next slide. So here's just a couple quick things to show the costs. If seniors were kept at home until they were able to, you know, just stay at home with proper home care supports, we could save many millions of dollars. And the cost of keeping someone in a hospital bed, and I think that's conservative, is 7 to 14 times as much as home care costs on a day-to-day basis. Next slide. So for the Home Care Workers Cooperative, I started working with them back in November of last year. And the Canadian Worker Co-op Federation provided a technical assistance grant to help me work with them as a co-op developer. They are working in the Peterborough and Durham regions of Ontario. And these are the objectives that they have. They're hoping to launch, if not this summer, then in the fall. So that's a pretty quick co-op development launch. It's about 6 to 8 months. And you can see that their objectives, as most worker co-ops, are create meaningful work and a decent wage. So $21 plus benefits, which is a living wage. Most PSWs in Ontario now are paid minimum wage or a bit above, which is $14 to $15. Many without benefits. They're often independent contractors. They don't get regular shifts. They don't get regular hours. They don't get sick leave. They don't get paid for travel time and mileage. So these are all the things that the Workers Cooperative wants to make sure that the PSWs that own their own not-for-profit will get. And you can see that the cost per week, 6 hours per week on average, is about $210 versus a private room on average is $808 in a long-term care home. Next slide. So from the PSW's perspective, one of the founders, Daniel Turpin, who's worked for 15 years in the health system as a PSW. She's worked in different long-term care homes and she's done home care as well. She recently left a long-term care home just before COVID because she couldn't actually stand working there anymore. She was speaking out for clients and patients and was getting no positive support from the management. So you can read her quotes there. But I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that the PSWs are really motivated by caring for other people, and they very much deserve to be paid a decent living wage and travel costs and benefits. And I know the union sector is looking at unionizing more PSWs, which would be a good thing. And we'll see how the training goes. Ontario is supposed to train another 10,000 or so PSWs in the coming 2 or 3 years. Next slide. So this is the message I'd like to leave you with, because I think this is the most important thing, that by taking care of the PSWs and our elder care workers, they can be more compassionate and take care of our loved ones. So that's really the solution. And I think worker-owned business as a not-for-profit is a great model. And I'm hoping it's going to catch on across Canada. There are some models around the world that have shown that this works, and we just simply need to adopt it, and we need government policy and funding to help us spread this model for PSW home care cooperatives.
Okay, so I think that's us.
Okay. Great, thank you. And under time too, congratulations. Okay, so then we'll just move on to our final presentation. Marc-Andre and Daphne are presenting on Canadian credit union responsiveness to COVID-19.
Okay.
Daphne, you should take it away, Daphne. Yeah.
Okay. Can you go back to the first slide?
Yeah, I did. I will. Just 1 second, please. Okay.
Okay, so our presentation title is Talking Like a Co-op, and I'm at St. Mary's University, teach accounting, and my connection, I guess, to the cooperative world is that I'm the executive director of our Center of Excellence in Accounting and Reporting for Cooperatives. So if you could move it along to the next slide. So what we're talking about today is some big ideas about why co-op talk matters, why it is important. And certainly language is very important in terms of how we conceptualize the world. And we're probably of cooperative isomorphism, and I've certainly seen evidence of that in my own previous studies of reporting by cooperatives, where they're either copying each other or, even more sadly, they're trying to reflect the language of banks. Next slide. So in terms of the literature, co-op talk is certainly influenced by the fact that many of our graduates, university graduates, are coming out without having even heard about cooperatives. So for example, in a survey of 17 US and Canadian textbooks, less than half mentioned co-ops, and those that did devoted only about 1 page. However, this wasn't always the case. Historically, textbooks in the early 20th century did have more content, but that changed after post-World War II. The references became fewer and fewer. Another issue with respect to co-op talk is the changing in the discourse that we have. So in the UK, when social enterprise discourse first started, co-ops really were an important focus. However, over time, that's actually shifted more towards the voluntary sector, and there's less emphasis on the co-ops themselves. In another study of the Irish credit unions, noted that there was a shift from discourse on community service to more focus and emphasis on enterprise discourse that focused on innovation and competitiveness. Next slide. So what is this research about? Well, as we all know, COVID-19 certainly had a significant financial impact on many individuals and businesses. And throughout the pandemic, Marc-Andre and I noticed there was a considerable amount of advertising and reinsurance from banks indicating that they were ready to step up and help their customers. So I guess the question on our minds was, how did credit unions respond to its customers and members in comparison to the bank's responses? So to do that, we examined the annual reports of the 12 largest credit unions in Canada. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Marc-Andre, who's going to present our findings.
Thanks, Daphne. One thing, in terms of trying to answer our research question, we thought we would take an approach that's come to be known as text as data, and it's a kind of a subset of this idea of big data, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And I'll just have a little animation here. Let me, there we go. It's called big textual data. Most of the discourse around big data refers to quite often financial data, like numbers, real quote unquote data. And the idea is you can predict people's behavior by looking at their, for example, their transactions, and provide them with custom services, that kind of thing. But in the last 10, 12 years, there's been a real explosion of this idea of treating text as data and seeing if we cannot infer important meaning from large volumes of text through these kind of more empirical approaches. Now, we only have a small sample. What we're sharing today is 12 credit unions and 5 or 6 large banks. But the ambition here is to expand this much more greatly. And in fact, even since we produced this presentation, we've gotten over 100 now documents from annual reports, and then eventually make this a kind of multi-year project where you would have, eventually thousands of documents. And so the idea is, can we pull meaning from those documents in an efficient way that is meaningful too. So the conceptual basis for this idea from a kind of theoretical perspective is that a big driver of our understanding, our understanding of language is around this like notion of frequency and co-occurrence, the kind of tying together of terms. And I've used this kind of illustrative example. You can come up with your own. This is my daughter, Emmylou. Her birthday's in about a week, and she's been pestering her mom and myself for about 3 months for a scooter. There's not a day go by when I look at her and I don't think scooter. And so this is just a simple example of how powerful repetition, frequency, and co-occurrence can kind of implant themselves in your mind. When we use Google search engines, we're drawing on this kind of basic understanding of language. When you have a meme that you're suddenly aware of, right? It's because you've been exposed to the term a lot, and it's probably co-occurring with some other thing that you're looking at. So we build these relationships. This is the underlying theoretical basis of treating text as data, and it's important to kind of ground things there. Now, that said, it's also important, whoops, there we go. We also have to remember that all quantitative models of language are wrong, but some are useful. So this is not to say this work is going to supplant conventional reading by, you know, trained people like all the folks on this call. That human involvement is still essential, and it's essential even for making sense of the results from this quantitative approach. But again, the idea is, can we take in vast amounts of text and draw meaning from them in a way that's supportive of the human-centric design? So I'd say the literature around this, which is just blossoming in the last 10, 12 years, is very sensitive to this point. It's a really important point. And a lot of the more machine language learning people partner with kind of more traditional analysts. So this point is really essential. The other thing that kind of note, and these are kind of methodological considerations I think are important to get out of the way before we share some results, is that we need to think about different approaches to textual analysis from a quantitative perspective along a continuum. On the one hand, you have these kind of deductive approaches that I would associate more with traditional content analysis, dictionary approaches, counting approaches. And then you've got the more recent approaches, which are machine language, either supervised or unsupervised, which are more inductive or inferential. And so what we're doing in this study is we're going to do a bit of both. We started with this kind of more deductive approach. That's the approach I'm much more familiar with from my background. But I've been, as Daphne will tell you, I've been like a kid in a candy shop with this more inductive approach, because there's just so much power and interesting things to kind of learn from there. So we'll just, I'll show you what I mean here in a minute. The other thing important methodologically now we're into kind of more methods kind of questions, is to understand that most of these analyses treat text as a bag of words. You know, if you imagine your Scrabble, if you play Scrabble, you've got letters in your bag. This would be the words in your bag. And what you need to do is then you draw inference from the frequency and collocation of those words in your bag. There's some kind of things you have to do along the way. You have to define your unit of analysis. In our case, as Daphne said, it's annual reports, but specific elements of annual reports, the CEO and chair messages, not the financial analysis. That's very structured by accounting norms, so we don't go include that. You need to pull those texts. That can involve a process called scraping, which we won't go into now. You need to name your files. This is an example of how I've named a file. And what that allows you to do is create variables out of your text that are really useful for all sorts of things. And then you need to create what's called a corpus, which is basically a library. You can imagine your library consists of all the text, in this case, all the annual reports that we pull together. And then you can pull from that library. You can withdraw books from that library, text from that library, using the variables we've created in the name. And then you apply your dictionary to this library that's been what's called tokenized. That is breaking up each text into words and then creating data matrices that count frequencies per word, per document, and then become something you can use mathematically. So that's in a very kind of crude sense what's going on here. And let's just look at some of our results from the deductive approach that we're taking. I'm just checking my time. I'm doing okay. So here's our dictionary. I wanted to say a few words about our dictionary. This is our dictionary for co-ops / credit unions, okay? what we did is Daphne and I came up with a list of words drawing on cooperative principles. These are words that we think are meaningful from a cooperative perspective. And then we surveyed co-op experts to kind of validate our dictionary. And then we had about 30 odd responses to that survey. And then from that survey, we chose the words, we put words in the co-op bucket versus the bank or IOF, investor-owned firm bucket, depending on the weight of the responses. So when people, some words were uniformly in the co-op bucket, for example, co-op, not surprisingly, and other words were uniformly in the IOF bucket. But there were other words where it was a little less clear. We went all the way up to about 60%. If 60% of respondents said a word belongs in category co-op or category investor-owned firm, then we plopped that word into the dictionary. And then we added a few of our own. I put in, for example, some words around jurisdiction to capture the idea that credit unions are more likely to speak about their local environment than a bank that has a national environment, national area of operation. So these are some of the terms. I won't belabor this slide too much, but we can come back to it in questions if there are any. And this is the investor-owned dictionary, things that you probably would expect: return on equity, return on investment, investors, customers. And this is contrasted with the credit union / co-op dictionary, which would focus more on community, members, that kind of thing, employees. These are the kinds of concepts you would expect to see in the respective documents. And the isomorphism perspective is that, if credit unions are slipping down this slope of being more like banks, you might start to see more investor-oriented language in their annual reports, and vice versa. Interestingly, with the banks increasingly adopting a lot of the language of corporate social responsibility, you might see the banks starting to bring in more language that you would typically associate with credit unions. So that would be, one kind of prediction that you might have going into this. Or you might have the other prediction, which is the one we kind of started with, or kind of HO, if you want to think of it that way, that the language would pattern quite closely to the structure or the organizational type. And now I'm going to show you some results. This is some preliminary results. This is an index that we created based on those dictionaries applied to each entity's document. And the greater the blue line, the more on the right of that gray line down the up and down, the vertical gray line, the greater the blue line, that means that entity has, let's say, more co-op talk. So they're talking about COVID because all the annual reports, the message from CEO and chairs are all in the context of COVID. Connexus, interestingly, had the most co-op talk. And that doesn't necessarily mean they're using the most co-op terms. It means they're using the least. It could also mean they're using the least investor-owned firm terms. In fact, they use 0 investor-owned firm terms in those annual reports. Whereas you go down the line, you see different credit unions have different ratios. There's a mathematical formula I put at the bottom here that shows how this index was constructed. But what's nice about this is you see the banks and the credit unions actually lining up on either side of that line. So it does suggest that the credit unions, at least superficially, are communicating in a way that maps reasonably close to this conceptual dictionary we've created. And the banks, by contrast, are also communicating in a way that's consistent with that dictionary we've created for investor-owned firms. So this is a deductive approach. As I said, we came in with this hypothesis about what the language should look like. We validated that dictionary that we created from that hypothesis, and then we see some with the community, and now we see some evidence that it's doing a pretty good job. Now there's some refinement that needs to be done, but this is the basic idea for the deductive approach. And then we can look at some inferential statistics, and this gets very technical very fast, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. But this is an image. I love this image of the murder of crows. Famously, you see 10 black crows. You expect the 11th to be also black, but that's kind of inferential kind of thinking, or inductive thinking. I want to show you something called topic modeling. This is really neat. It's using a technique called latent Dirichlet analysis, and this is a Bayesian. I won't go into the details here, but this is a Bayesian kind of approach to thinking about language. So language is conditional on the language we use is conditional on other languages, basically the idea. And you get to set the number of topics and the number of words per topic that you want this algorithm to kind of discern from the text you're feeding it, okay? And so at the top here, I said, let's look for 3 clusters, 3 topics that are in this corpus. And what this algorithm found are these 3 topics here. So topic 1, bank, risk, business, management, impact. Topic 2, member financial support, community help. Topic 3, members year board, continue credit. So this is the analytic part of this story. This is where the analyst comes in. You can see the human interpretation part of this. This technology does not tell you what the topic is. You have to infer it from the words. But what it's doing really nicely is it's pulling out a topic here that's very clearly aligned with investor-owned firms. This topic 1, bank, risk, management, business, impact. When banks are writing their annual reports, they're writing to investors who care about the business as a business, right? And you can see this very clearly. The model is picking that up really clearly. And then if you contrast that with topic 2, this is clearly, and topic 3, these are clearly credit union topics. And they're speaking to the idea that the credit unions are appealing to their communities. They're talking about supporting the communities. They're talking about their members. They're talking about helping them. And they're talking about continuity and other things, right? So this is the model is actually doing a really good job, even with a small sample, of picking up what we humans would say are probably the important topics. And this maps nicely to our deductive approach, which kind of assumes something like this. And then I put a two cluster approach here, and you can see even more clearly, topic 1 is banks, topic 2 is credit unions. And these terms, member, community, not year and continuity, but these terms are in our dictionary. So this is really neat. This is kind of a validation of our dictionary, but also, from another methodological method perspective. Something that's missing here, if you've been paying attention and may surprise you, is the word co-op does not appear. Cooperative, it's in our dictionary. It's in, the LDA method should be picking it up, but it's not. It's not a term that's used much in any of the discourse, certainly not the banks. You don't see it at all in the banks, but even in the credit unions.
Andre, but if we could just wrap up, we're out of time.
Yep. This is my second last slide. You can see here's the count for credit unions that use the term co-ops. One of them has a no use. Van City's up near the top, which is probably not all that surprising. But what is a little surprising is Coast Capital is up there in the mix. This is not a credit union I would have expected would be using these terms aggressively, and we can speculate about that. This is what's called keyword in context. I won't belabor this, but it shows you how the terms are used by each of the organizations. So to conclude, there's a lot of work to do still around validating. We want to test some of these approaches against websites and content that are prototypically co-op versus investor-owned firms. So I'm thinking ICA, Fraser. I think there's an opportunity to do supervised methods to train an algorithm about really specifically about what a co-op looks like. I think there's opportunities to refine machine learning approaches and extending this analysis using some scrape data that we've just received. And that is that. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Well, thank you so much. Wow, like so much fantastic ground was covered there in those 3 presentations. It's almost hard to know where to begin the conversation. So if there's any burning questions rising to the top for anybody on the call, we have about 6 minutes for Q&A. So if you wanted to either put them in the chat, or you can type your name in the chat, or I think there's a raise hand function. I don't know where that is, but everybody can feel free to turn on your videos as well at this point if you are comfortable with that. Oh, and I see Marc Andre, it looks like you have your hand up.
Am I allowed to ask a question of another presenter?
I would say go right ahead, please.
Okay. This is for Daryl. I was interested in the Camino discussion because, of course, they've been supported by the federal government and the Cooperative Development Foundation, but you didn't mention that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about, not the Camino, sorry, the Norandino, sorry. If you could speak to that point as well, Daryl.
Yeah, I actually wrote a report on a project that CDF funded with them. That's about a 60-page report. I can send that to you if you want more details. but they've got support. They had an earlier project with them as well. So the key thing about Norandino is from the start, they had this alliance where they set up this NGO where they've got extremely successful in getting development funds from large German agencies, but also French agencies. They've worked well with Café Direct in the UK. And they just have incredible capacity to direct these funds. They started off first by implementing projects from other NGOs, and now they go out and they design their own projects. And this was good with Cooperative Development Fund because the first project was sort of driven by CDF, and the second project was sort of driven by Norandino, which is quite different. And so they've done some interesting things. Some of the actual things that came out of it was actually a youth cooperative. They have their own new local brand called Café Futuro, which is set up with a youth cafe things. So all sorts of really interesting projects coming out of that. And as I say, co-op support was really important for them in their initial phases, but now because they're doing so well in some areas, they don't have to rely on those solidarity buyers, right? Whether it's La Siembra, Equal Exchange, Café Direct, and many of those markets, they're just selling because they have the highest quality product out there. And they can get higher prices in some of those non-fair trade markets than they can in the fair trade market. So they're incredible what they're doing. Yeah.
We have a question from Russ as well in the chat. Russ, is that for Daryl as well? Yeah, okay. How does the future of fair trade and co-ops look?
Oh, that is, I just had to find my crystal ball there somewhere. That really depends because it's getting more competitive. There's all these new regulations. It's getting a lot of what we say fair washing, people pretending to be fair trade, not really fair trade. On the other hand, we have community organizing around things. So we have all this network in Canada and the UK of fair trade towns, fair trade cities, fair trade universities, fair trade workplaces, which are basically developing purchasing policies, right? So that they will buy those products. So that's incredible. And it's a great opportunity for education. I missed one session yesterday because I was in a fair trade meeting trying to get our university designated as a fair trade university, right? So all sorts of wonderful opportunities, and these north-south links are so important as well. Fair trade needs a little bit more love from the co-op sector. If you go to the international meetings, they're not really represented. It's the larger co-ops, the housing co-ops, the finance co-ops. We're not really integrated them as well in terms of some of these things. But there's lots of potential. The co-op sector could provide some more support systematically.
Okay, great. And we are like coming to like the last minute of our time together. I see Isabel has a question.
Actually, I wish we had more time because I'd like to ask 2 questions. But anyway, Judith and Russ, I was really struck by the extent to which the naturalized prejudices are so much part of the story of where we've got to in long-term care. And, many of us have been grappling with how do you address this? How do you change things? So what are your strategies going forward?
Judith, do you want to start?
You go ahead, Russ.
Okay, so, I think the most important thing that we're talking about is in terms of not-for-profit model and a cooperative model that provides the caregivers with secure employment, a living wage, benefits. Those are the things that we need in order to provide the proper care for our elders. And that will go a long way to eliminating or moving or alleviating some of the ageism and the dehumanization of older people in our society, because right now we're just warehousing them, and we've been doing that for a long time. Like, it's not a new thing, but it's getting worse because we have a youth obsessed society. So I think by taking care of the caregivers, it gives us a much better opportunity to move away from that dehumanization.
Yeah, I think, Isabel, that a lot of times the caregivers are the ones who get, you know, get all of the flack from the families. You know, we don't treat them well. No one treats them well. And so, you know, these are people who want to care for people. A lot of times they're people who have a natural ability to care for others. And so we need to treat them better because they get treated, it's kind of a reflection of who they're working with. They're working with elders who we don't value, so we don't value them.
Yeah. Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time. It looks like we could chat for a bit longer. I think there's an opportunity to jump on over into the networking lounge if anybody wanted to continue chatting through that forum. So please do that if that's something that you'd like to do. I'd like to thank all of the presenters today for really like some great information. So I want to know so much more about all of these topics. So thank you. And I should just promote the next session as well. We now have a half an hour break, and then at 2:30 Mountain Time, we have our Human Books Library. So that's sounds like a very exciting opportunity to connect with some of our we have several human people who've graciously agreed to be human books. So maybe take a break, stretch your legs, get a drink if you need to, and then head on over to session H1, the Human Books Library. Okay, and with that, I'll close out this session. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.